Hello? Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Doreen Saskin. Welcome to Holy Blossom, and thank you for joining us for this event in our series of expert talks, brought to you by the committee of the Luke Sklar Mental Health Initiative. This initiative was established in 2018 by a group of volunteers whose goal was to provide education, support, and resources related to the challenges of living with or supporting someone with mental illness. Our aim is to contribute to ending the stigma around mental illness and encourage those who need it to seek help. This talk will be recorded to allow those who are interested to view this at a later date. Life can be chaotic at times. Many of us are blindsided by major challenges. Some examples include a serious physical or mental health illness, an unexpected death, or the estrangement of children or grandchildren. DBT, or dialectical behavior therapy, offers a way to effectively manage our emotions and tolerate distress. Tonight, we are so fortunate to have Dr. Shelley McMain as our expert speaker. She will outline what DBT is and will educate us with practical DBT techniques to successfully deal with life's challenges and to improve our mental health. We invite our live stream guests to post questions at any time in the chat box. Before we invite Dr. McMain up to speak, Rabbi Elisa McCarroll will now provide us with a brief Jewish lens on managing life's challenges.
So thank you, Doreen, and I'm looking forward to learning with all of you and with Dr. McMain tonight. So in case you were not aware, Purim is coming. Purim starts next Thursday evening. And there just happens to be, when we're talking about dealing with life's challenges, a verse from the Megillah, the story of Esther, which I think can speak to this idea. So in the book of Esther, chapter 4, we read, if it is Mordecai talking to Esther, and he says to her, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another place, another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. Umi yodea im le'et kazot higata lamalchut. And who knows, perhaps you have attained a royal position exactly for this crisis, exactly for this moment. And Rabbi and famous Talmudist Adin Steinsaltz will then pick up on this idea of, for this time, perhaps you have arrived, exactly for this, perhaps you have arrived, perhaps you've attained this position exactly for this time. And he says, and he comments, you, Esther, came into a position of power without planning to do so. You faced something unexpected, something challenging. And now you find yourself in a situation where you can act to change the course of events and thereby save your people. Don't you think that this apparent coincidence is significant? Can't you see that it is a sign from heaven? And so what do we learn from these comments is about resolving difficult problems, living through difficult times, facing difficult challenges. I think we learn from both Rabbi Steinsaltz and the Megillah that we are taught not to remain silent, not to hold on to these burdens by ourselves, that it's not helpful to keep quiet or to do nothing, or the problem is just going to stay there, nothing's going to resolve. The other piece that we learn, and what Rabbi Steinsaltz is trying to twist onto the Megillah, is to say that we can turn these challenges into opportunities. And who knows, perhaps like Esther, we are the exact right person to make the problem better. Even if we don't think that we can play a part, perhaps we learn that there are no coincidences in Jewish thought, in Jewish tradition. And finally, we learn that perhaps we are not able to change people's minds. We can't control them, but we can control ourselves, and we can control the things that we are able to take control of, and thereby work to improve the circumstances of ourselves and hopefully also our loved ones and our community around us. So as we learn tonight, and as we learn from our Jewish tradition, perhaps we too can learn how to arrive exactly at this moment and learn how to face these challenges together. Erev Tov.
Thank you, Rabbi McCarroll, for that insightful message. And now just a very few words about our speaker before she begins. Dr. Shelley McMain is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. She heads the Borderline Personality Disorder Clinic and is a clinician scientist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. She is a practicing psychotherapist, trainer, educator, and researcher. Dr. McMain is a certified DBT individual and group therapist and currently serves on the International DBT Strategic Planning Committee. Her clinical interests focus on the areas of psychotherapy, DBT, borderline personality disorder, emotional regulation, and most importantly, the mechanisms of change. She is also a founder and co-director of a local private practice on Eglinton called the Center for Mind-Body Health. Her work and numerous publications have led to many research and teaching awards, including from the Department of Psychiatry and the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto. Dr. McMain.
Hello. I'll just adjust this. First of all, oops, if I can, that's the trick. Just push. Maybe not. Oops. Okay. Is that good enough? You can hear me. Okay, perfect. Okay, well, thank you for having me here. Thank you, Doreen, for inviting me. And also, it's a real honor to be part of this series. And I think a really important initiative that you are organizing with others to honor Luke's memory. So, and really important for other people also. I also wanted to thank the rabbi for her comments because she summed up my talk in about 3 minutes. Everything she said is what I will say in more words. So you'll find out very quickly there is a lot in Judaism that really gets rephrased in different ways in variety of psychotherapy. So I was also going to comment on the fact that it's Purim this coming week. And of course, this is also supposed to be a time that we're feeling more happy, right, with Purim on the doors. And so I do think it's a good time to be able to reflect on how do we navigate life's challenges in a way that we can become more resilient and we can experience less suffering and a bit more joy in our lives. So I'm happy to share with you a few DBT strategies, but they may not be so new, as you've perhaps already heard. So probably we've all had moments, if you're human, you've had moments in your life where you felt really overwhelmed by your emotions. Maybe you felt frustrated with your partner or your kids, and you've said something that you later thought perhaps was not the most effective or wise thing to say, and that you later regretted, or maybe you got a bit overwhelmed by some anxiety and you decided perhaps to withdraw or avoid and just not deal with something that was a little bit too overwhelming. And we all do that, so you're human if you do that. And I think, the challenge is, of course, these moments when we get really overwhelmed by our emotions, they impact ourselves, how we see ourselves, how we feel about ourselves, our mood, and they impact our relationships with other people. There is a very nice quote that's attributed to Viktor Frankl. It's not entirely clear if he said these exact words. That's why I've said attributed. But as the quote goes, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. And I think what's important about this point is the idea that we have power to choose our response. And it really comes in those moments where there is a space between something occurring, some stimulus, and then what do we do next with that? So I invite you to take a moment to think about just the last day or the last 2 days, reflect on any moment when you felt overwhelmed by your emotions. Maybe you got overwhelmed with fear or sadness or insecurity, self-doubt. And in that moment, just consider, how did you actually respond when you were overwhelmed by your emotions? And if you reflect on how you responded, take a moment to think about, would you, if you could play the replay button, would you have done anything differently? Would you have wanted to respond a little bit differently in that moment? Sometimes that just little moment pause can allow us to do something a bit different. So DBT is a psychotherapy approach that includes, it's not entirely this, but it does include a lot of specific skills. And the skills are really practical ways that I think are relevant to anybody, not just a formal therapy context. So they're relevant to anybody who wants to find ways to modulate how you're feeling and shift how you're reacting to situations. So I thought it would be helpful if I shared a little bit about what is DBT, so you know what it is, simply because I think understanding how DBT was founded at least gives some insight into what are these strategies and why do you use them. So this is a picture of Marsha Linehan. She's the developer of DBT. She's a psychologist in Seattle, and she developed this treatment in the late 80s. It's a very structured psychotherapeutic approach. It's really designed to help people learn to modulate their emotions. And when I mean modulate, it means influence how you're feeling. Can you bring the volume down on certain emotions like fear or anger, or can you actually feel more of something, maybe feel more joy? So have some influence over your emotions. And it integrates both ideas from Western psychology and really more of an empirical, rational approach to how do you change. And it also integrates that with ideas from Eastern spiritual practice, contemplative practices, so specifically Buddhism. So I'll share a little bit more about what are the three, I think, key features. There's many aspects to DBT, but I think there's three key features that are relevant to how do we make changes? How do we shift our own reactions? And the first is the idea that DBT is built on this idea, or founded on this idea of a world view of dialectics, or philosophy of dialectics. And what does that actually mean? Basically means that there is a perspective, and this is a Hegelian philosophical perspective, that reality is very complex. We all know this. It's quite complex, and reality is comprised of natural tensions and natural contradictions. If you consider atoms have a positive charge, they have a negative charge. Breathing, it involves both inhaling and exhaling. And if you look around us, there's always contradictions or tensions in reality. Even the way we converse with people involves oftentimes tensions and conflict. And the idea from a dialectical perspective of, well, how do you change? How do you make changes? First have to understand, well, why do we not make changes? And from a dialectical perspective, we don't change when we get stuck. We get stuck in a situation where things remain in conflict. Maybe we're stuck in an argument, with our child, and we're stuck on we're right and they're wrong and they better, repair, and we're not budging. So we kind of get stuck in who's right and who's wrong. And that's when things stagnate. And so from a dialectical perspective, if you actually want to make changes, what you need to do is you need to find a synthesis at these moments of tension. And a synthesis means actually finding what's valid, what's reasonable about these different perspectives, which means in an argument, you've got to actually figure out what is valid about the other person's view, what's valid about yours, and how can you find a new state of meaning or understanding. So that's one idea. And this philosophy really permeates the treatment and strategies about how do you change. Because from a dialectical perspective, and Rabbi, you already shared this, I think, in what you said, from a dialectical perspective, you change by first accepting. So you need to accept reality as it is, and that's essential. And that means being able to accept without judging, without saying, I don't like this isn't okay. That's a key path to being resilient and to growth. Of course, another way to change is through actionable steps. Maybe you have to actually talk in a more direct, clear, and non-judgmental manner with somebody. Maybe you have to modify what you're actually doing if you want a different interaction with somebody. So it's this idea of you need to be able to balance acceptance and change. And again, this isn't new. There's nothing in DBT that's new, and Marsha Linehan would have said that. She said she stole all the best ideas from all sorts of other things, and just what's new is she put it together nicely. But I think this idea of acceptance and change really cuts across most spiritual traditions. It cuts across certainly Judaism, with phrases like tikkun olam and repairing the world, and the idea of gam zu l'tova, so being able to, the idea that, this too is good. In other words, we have to endure suffering. So those ideas of change and making actionable steps to do something different will be key to how do you actually modify your own responses. The other key characteristic of DBT that cuts across the treatment is its focus on emotions. So DBT is an emotion-focused treatment, and a lot of the strategies have a focus on emotions. And why? The rationale is that, emotions provide us all with really important signals. They provide us with information about what we need. And at a most basic bioevolutionary basis, emotions are guiding us. And what I'm talking about is our primary emotional response to situations. Sometimes we have secondary responses, Sometimes we feel ashamed, but instead we get angry at somebody. And that would be not a primary response, the anger, but the primary would be maybe feeling shame. So that's the second feature. And the third feature, and I think the piece that I love most about DBT, is that a lot of the skills in DBT, and again, the skills are one piece of it, but they're very practical, they're very teachable, and they're very accessible, and they're very actionable. And so that's what I really want to talk about tonight, is some of the skills in DBT. I think Marsha Linehan's brilliance was really writing these skills up in a very pithy, accessible way, a little bit of a how-to guide. How do you get yourself to accept, or how do you get yourself to say something in a very effective manner? So there are, I maybe will just say one thing, there are 4 different groups of skills. We're going to touch on some of these from the different modules. One group of skills has to do with mindfulness, and so there are a variety of skills. Mindfulness is how do you take control of your attention, be present in a non-judgmental way. Another set of skills is how do you regulate your emotions? In other words, how do you make sense of emotional information, understand what you're feeling, increase positive emotions. And then there's a set of skills that have to do with how do you convey what you want or say no to somebody in a really effective manner that increases the odds people will actually respond to you positively. It doesn't guarantee people respond to you positively, but it increases the odds. And then finally, there's a set of skills that has to do with how do you tolerate really intense distress. So we all have times in our life where we're going to face very painful emotions, and sometimes that comes up fast and furious, and it can be very devastating. How do you get through those moments in a way that doesn't make the situation worse? So those are the distress tolerance skills. So I want to start with just talking a little bit about some skills for navigating emotions more broadly, and then skills for navigating challenging relationships. And I thought, I wanted to say something first about the fact that, on the one hand, we all have our own personal challenges that we're facing on a regular basis. It may be small, simple things like, I just got a new cell phone and now I cracked the screen on it a day later and feel frustrated about that. Or maybe it's something a bit more significant, like I just got diagnosed with a pretty serious illness and now I've got that to contend with. But there's also, at a global level, a lot of stressors and barriers and challenges that we face. I mean, look what's happening in the world right now. Do I need to say more? Changing world order, global rise of anti-Semitism. There's all of the challenges with just natural disasters and global warming. I could go on and on about all of the get distressed just thinking about it all. But, so there's both big challenges, and then there's other challenges, our day-to-day struggles in life. And, again, I think, Rabbi, you had said this already, that on the one hand, we could face these always as catastrophes or major obstacles and get really stressed. And it's not to say it's not abnormal. When we face a challenge or obstacle or a threat, it's normal to experience often emotion dysregulation, and these are incredible opportunities for growth. So these are both difficult and they're moments that we can move and we can grow with them. So how do we actually deal with all of these catastrophes? So this is a quote by Jon Kabat-Zinn. So many of you may be familiar with Jon Kabat-Zinn, who has written extensively about mindfulness. Catastrophe here doesn't mean disaster. Rather, it means the poignant enormity of our life experience. It includes crisis and disaster, the unthinkable and the unacceptable, but it also includes all the little things that go wrong and that add up. The phrase reminds us that life is always in flux. Again, that dialectical idea that everything we think is permanent, it's temporary and constantly changing. So this includes our ideas, our opinions, our relationships, our jobs, our possessions, our creations, our bodies, everything. And I think, a couple of important points in that quote. One, life is always in flux. Some days are sunnier than others. Some days are pretty gloomy and pretty stormy. And everything that we think is permanent is actually only temporary and constantly changing. So there's 3 specific skills that I wanted to focus on to begin with to address how do you build in that pause when emotions get activated in a more intense way. And I think probably the first and probably most important skill that is really a prerequisite to doing anything else is the ability to notice, to pay attention, to actually see the situation clearly. And so this is really the essence of what mindfulness practice is about. It's the ability to have your eyes wide open and see what's there. It's a little bit like in this room, it's got all this furniture here. If you were to close your eyes and walk around the room, that would be more difficult. But if you open your eyes and you see what's in front of you, it's a lot easier to navigate the room. So being present to the current moment is one key aspect of being mindful. And another key aspect is the idea of not judging. Because I could walk around this room with my eyes open, but I could say, I don't like the color of that chair. They should have changed that wall. I don't like the way, looking at Cindy, my architectural design here. But yes, that could be different here. So, you could go around with a lot of judgments about how things look, and you're not really accepting reality, right? You're sort of pushing away from it, that I don't like it. It's not the way I want it to be. So being present without judgment is key to practicing mindfulness. And there's a couple of ways to practice mindfulness. The first is to simply observe, just notice, almost as if you're an infant who has no words for your experience, just bringing your full attention to your senses. and just noticing without words. And a second way would be to pay attention and notice your senses and then put words on your experience. And just that ability to be open to what is in the current moment with your eyes wide open. Now, there's a lot of benefits, and you may be aware, for those of you who already have mindfulness practices, the benefits are, if your eyes are open and you see what's there, it's a lot easier to make effective choices. It's also less stressful. Most people feel more relaxed. You don't always feel more relaxed because sometimes, you might not like what you see. If you're facing a situation like somebody has just died and you're grieving, actually, it's very hard to move in and fully accept what is. It's hard to stay with that grief. And yet, that is the pathway through grief, is to not avoid and not deny it. But most people, I think, experience a sense of uplift. It's refreshing to be able to just take a moment to observe, to notice. And the nice thing is you don't have to do this. I think this is something that's emphasized quite a bit in DBT. You don't have to do this by sitting on a cushion for an hour or two on every day, practicing being mindful. So a lot of what can be practiced is through practicing mindful of everyday activities. It might be right now just noticing. How do you notice the sensation of your seat on the chair you're sitting on? What do you notice? Or it may be noticing how you're brushing your teeth when you go home tonight and go to bed. Just bringing your full attention to that. Because oftentimes our mind is not in the present moment. We take a shower, but we're actually not really with ourselves in the shower. Our mind is somewhere else. We're somewhere else. And so that practice of being fully present. So I'm going to invite you just to have a little practice with this. And some of you, again, may have your own mindfulness practices, but I'm going to invite you into a brief practice right now. And the invitation is, it's not to observe and say, do I like, do I not like? The invitation is to simply observe without judgment. So just notice. And I will put up a picture, and then I'll invite you to notice. So I know the initial reaction might be strong, and just notice. Maybe take a breath. And take a deep breath. And again, the practice is about being aware. It's not about liking, disliking, but just being aware. Just notice, gazing at this image. Just notice any thoughts, any emotions, any physical sensations that come up. Maybe notice. Do you notice any tension anywhere? And if you notice judgments, just see if your mind is going to judgments. Maybe good, maybe bad, maybe more bad. Just notice those judgments. Just observe them, whatever the thoughts are, and see if you can notice, that's a judgment, and then bring yourself back to just observing. So just observing the photo. Maybe take a moment just to notice internally, what are you aware of in your body as you're looking at this photo? What's going on inside? Perhaps you feel tension somewhere. What are you aware of in your chest and your shoulders? And maybe then shift your attention back to the photo and just notice, are you noticing anything about the colors or the shapes? And then I invite you just to close with a deep breath. So just take a slow inhalation, exhalation, just releasing any lingering reactions. And just take a moment to reflect on, is there anything that you observed that maybe was new to you or different in observing that photo? You don't need to share it right now. You can keep it to yourself, but just a moment in trying to practice observing mindfully without judgment. Were you aware of anything different? Because often when we move into judgments, we are now moving away from some primary emotional experience. And it's an opportunity to get curious about what is that? What is that emotional experience that's getting activated? So this is a second skill I want to touch on that is also a mindfulness skill. And it's the skill of how do you notice what state of mind you're in? Do you ever notice that you're not necessarily in the same state of mind? Sometimes you're really upset and you're really frustrated or you're really afraid. And you just sort of feel overwhelmed by your emotions. And in that state, you really want to act. Maybe you want to call your daughter and let her know something about what happened, or call your sister or do something. And often in that state, you get really overwhelmed by emotions. You do end up doing things quickly. Those are often the moments that we later think, maybe that wasn't the best thing I did, or maybe I could have taken a pause there. So that's what we refer to as an emotional state of mind. It has some advantages. If I'm walking down the street and suddenly a car sort of veers a little bit close to the sidewalk and I'm worried it's about to hit me, I'm jump out of the way. I'm not thinking, oh, I should move, there's a car coming. I'm acting from my emotion mind. So it has advantages because you act quickly. But the disadvantage is that your perspective is very narrow. You're really only honing in on your emotional reaction. And that's often when people do things, say things, react in ways that aren't so healthy. It might be emotionally getting overwhelmed and blowing up with somebody, or getting overwhelmed and deciding to drink a whole bottle of wine or something, or whatever it is, where you're just acting on some intense emotion. Now, in contrast to that, there's another state of mind that we often get into called reasonable mind or rational mind. And that's almost a state of mind when we're in this bit of cold, logical state of mind. Do you ever have that where you notice you're with somebody, you're talking, but you feel like you're in your head? You're very logical, but you're not really feeling things. Maybe somebody's criticizing you and you get very tense and very rigid, and you're not really feeling, you've just cut yourself off. So rational state of mind, again, it's not an entirely negative state of mind. It can be useful. If I'm at home and I'm trying to bake a cake and I need to triple the recipe, it's very helpful to be in a rational state of mind because I've got to calculate what I'm doing, and it's helpful to be in a logical, reasonable state of mind. I probably don't want to be totally emotional while I'm, trying to do these calculations. But the problem is, again, you're cut off from important information. You're cut off from your emotions. And so wise mind is really this synthesis of both emotional and reasonable state of mind. And wise mind is ultimately what we're trying to cultivate as we practice mindfulness. So what do we mean by wise mind? And we all have wise mind. We all have access to wise mind. Wise mind is that place that I'm sure you've all been in at some point, where you have a sense of intuitive knowing. Often there's a sense of a deep calm. There's a sense of really feeling grounded. And in that state of mind, often that's when you really want to that's when you want to be making your decisions on how to act, how to respond, from a grounded, calm, really solid place. And that's a state when, we're able to feel connected to others, we feel compassionate towards others. So that's wise mind. And so one of the practices in DBT is to actually begin to practice noticing when you're in a different state of mind. So I know my kids have heard it enough. It's like, are you in emotion mind right now? Just take a step back. So it's like, just recognize it. Because if you can recognize it, then you can make a decision. Oh, if this is emotion mind, don't make a big decision. Hold off and wait. Get yourself into wise mind before you make the next move. Now, of course, sometimes when our emotions get activated, they can be very intense and they can be really overwhelming, and it can be very hard in that state to not make very hasty decisions. and really do things quite impulsively. And I'm sure we've all had at least a few moments of those. We all have these experiences. There is one specific skill. There's many skills, but there's one specific skill that I find particularly helpful in DBT, and it's simply called the stop skill. So what do we mean by the stop skill? It's simply a skill that involves observing yourself in a very heightened state of emotional intensity and pushing a pause button. That's all it is just put the pause button. And I find, the first step to it is actually saying to myself, stop. And I find it helpful just to mentally envision a stop sign, like just stop. Don't move a muscle, don't say anything. Just actually stop yourself in your tracks when your emotions are very high. Say you're 7 out of 10 in terms of intensity, and you're about to launch into really things that would not be helpful or making decisions that might have a long-term impact or damage on a relationship. The next step, apart from stopping in your tracks, saying nothing, freezing, so to speak, would be take a step back, just step back. In a sense, invite some mindfulness. It can be helpful to breathe. And oftentimes, it's just encouraging people to slow your breath down. It's a great way to reduce your emotional arousal by addressing your body's physiology. And when you're breathing, it's helpful to have a longer exhalation and a shorter inhalation. So I usually recommend breathe in to the count of 4. And again, because that's activating your sympathetic system, and breathe out to the count of 6, because that's activating your parasympathetic system, and you want to decrease your body's physiology. And then the O in stop is just observe. Again, this is mindfulness. Just observe. Observe any emotional reactions and notice body physiology. Are you tense? So bring mindfulness to your awareness, to your own reaction. Be mindful of where you're at. Maybe you're in a situation. Maybe saying something isn't the best time. You're sitting over Passover Seder dinner, and maybe this isn't the moment to perhaps have a particular conversation with a child about something that's very sensitive. And then the P in the stop is proceed mindfully. And this idea of proceeding mindfully is when you're acting from your wise mind. So again, that grounded, intuitive place. You're able to see a much bigger picture than just what's right there in the moment. You're able to both be in the moment, but you also are able to expand your view beyond this moment. And, I think of this idea of being effective where you can keep your eye on the ball. What's your goal? Maybe you've got everybody over for a Seder, and actually your goal was to have a really nice family dinner where there's not a big argument. Actually, that was the main goal. And so therefore, actually saying nothing would be in line with your goal. And maybe there's another time to address other issues. So those are 3 skills for working with your own reactivity and trying to build in that pause. Now, most of us, again, our emotion and our emotional overwhelm often comes in relationships. We are frustrated with people, or we're worried about situations, or it's often very relationally based. And so I wanted to talk a little bit, how do you navigate relationships when there's tension in relationships and when there's conflict in relationships? And tension can arise oftentimes when we don't want it to arise. It might be, you've just suffered a loss in your family, and now you and your siblings are all struggling over the funeral arrangements. And it's not a time that you really want to be in this struggle with people, because you're all vulnerable and you're emotional and you're upset. And it's actually the last time you want to be in conflict. And how do you navigate those moments that are really challenging when emotions are now there in this very sensitive moment? We all have these moments, and we all have things that maybe push us more than others, that are hot buttons. It might be, my brother saying something that is like, oh, he's doing that again, or, or somebody doing something again that activates our own negative emotions. So, and oftentimes in those moments, it's our really unhelpful communication that can fuel things. I get reactive, and now I might, not from a wise mind place, but from my emotion mind place, say something that maybe isn't very helpful, and then the other person reacts back, and now you've got this dysfunctional cycle where it's just spiraling and getting a bit more out of control. So relationship quality is really about how do you navigate tension in particular when it arises. And there's 3 skills that I think are really useful for navigating these moments, and I'll share a bit about these, starting with just this idea of practicing dialectics. So the idea here is that, again, we talked about the idea of dialectics. Dialectical philosophy talks about the fact that reality is constantly in a state of tension. And so when tension arises in a relationship, it's helpful to be able to recognize it. It may be there you are trying to sort out funeral arrangements, and you and one of your siblings are getting a bit tense about what should be done, or who should, just whatever the details are. And in that moment, just noticing, we are in conflict with one another, we're bickering with one another, there is tension. And that's really sort of step 1, is recognizing when things get polarized. And it may be, and I know my kids have heard this before, I'm said, it's like, okay, I think we're polarized right now. So it's just naming it out loud. I think you and I are polarized. And that's just acknowledging we're at odds. We're in a conflict. And it's not abnormal. We all get there, but how do you then go through it? First is to name it. And the second place would be to actually figure out, because we know that, well, actually, there's validity in multiple perspectives. There's not, I don't hold, my perspective isn't all right and that person's perspective all wrong. There's multiple valid perspectives. And so the trick is trying to figure out, well, what is valid about the other person's perspective? And what's valid about my perspective? And it's about being able to hold the complexity of life, that there can be 2 different ideas that are different, and you can hold those together. And then the next step is, can you find a synthesis? And a synthesis is where you can take 2 different ideas, maybe 2 different ideas that you're trying to negotiate about what's important for this Passover Seder meal or whatever it is that you're having tension around, and you try to identify what's valid from your perspective, what's valid from mine. And now, can we actually come up with a middle ground here? And middle ground doesn't mean we do it my way. That's not the middle ground. The middle ground is where we find elements of both perspectives, and so we can coexist. Now, there's also, of course, the challenge when we get in these situations is how do you communicate, not only from a wise mind place, but how do you put into words effectively what you want? How do you say no, or how do you ask somebody for something? There is a very pithy, helpful skill in DBT. It's called the Dear Man skill. And I'll say it briefly here, but the first idea is you first want to know what's your priority. What's important to you? Is there some objectives you have? Or maybe your priority is you really want to maintain your relationship with family. Maybe that's the most important thing. Or maybe it's about self-respect. You're feeling constantly put down or criticized by somebody publicly, and you really feel like you need to stand up and say something because it doesn't feel good. And it could be that there's all of those priorities exist, but knowing what you need is key to then moving in and putting into words what you want. So the Dear Man skill is simply this. What you want to do is start by describing. The D is describe. And you just state the facts. Maybe, I don't have a pithy example here, but maybe the facts are, I had Passover Seder the last 2 years. Maybe that's the fact. And maybe then you move to express what you feel. And maybe, so the feeling is, I feel resentful that I have to do it all the time. That's not a feeling. So you have to go for the feeling word. So maybe, I feel a little tired. I feel a little exhausted from doing it the past 2 years. And then you go to the ask, the A. So this is where you assert your need. I would really like you to do it this year. So that's the ask. And then the R is you want to reinforce the person for giving you what you want. And it may be, our relationship, I think, is going to be less tense if we have a little bit of reciprocity around how we're handling the festival meals. So I just feel like it'll be smoother for things. So the man part is where you state things mindfully. So what does it mean by mindful? Where you don't lose sight of what your goal is, you're effective. It means if somebody's starting to throw in attacks or insult you, you don't get swayed by that, but instead it's a little bit like you're playing a broken record. You come back to just describing, saying how you feel, what do you want, and then reinforce the person. And the A is say it assertively. I think you stand up, look at the person in the eyes, don't, hold your head low, be assertive, appear confident. And the N is be prepared to negotiate. We're not always going to get what we want when we ask assertively. And sometimes we have to negotiate and we have to give and take in a situation. But it's a very useful skill, I think, for how do you especially say things that can be really difficult. Now, there's an important part in effective communication, and it involves how do you validate people? How do you convey to others that I understand you? Because validation is a key part of helping people feel more emotionally calm themselves, reducing emotion dysregulation. So I have a short video that I think captures validation.
It's just, there's all this pressure, And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. All of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't...
Okay. I think that little clip captures validation extremely well. You got the idea of it. So, and we've all had these moments, right? When we're with somebody and they're saying something and we're thinking, that's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. And we want to say that, and maybe that's helpful, but it oftentimes, if you're in a situation where there's a lot of tension, if you want to help people the other person get more regulated, then you need to move in with some validation. Even if you disagree or you think what they're saying is crazy, you need to find something that you can highlight that does make sense. And that is the essence of validation. It's where you're moving in and you're simply highlighting what is reasonable, what is understandable, and what does make sense. And there's a lot of ways that you can validate. You can just simply give the person your attention. Sometimes we don't. We walk away, we roll our eyes, or we do other things. I don't really give them full attention, but it's about being fully present to the person without judgment, listening to them, and reflecting back. Yeah, that makes sense. I understand what you're feeling. Or I understand, you think I didn't do X, Y, Z. I understand. That must be hurtful if you think I don't care. I think dialogues we can often get into with our kids. You didn't, whatever, those dialogues that are often, people feeling misunderstood. So there's a lot of things that can be validated. You can validate what somebody feels, what they're thinking. The key is to validate what is reasonable and to not necessarily validate what isn't reasonable. It doesn't make sense to say, oh, that's a great idea, really, that seems really reasonable, when you're actually thinking, no, that's crazy, that seems very impulsive. I wouldn't do that. If you think it's not helpful, it doesn't make sense to say it is helpful. But you might say, look, I understand you really want to do this. So I could validate somebody's desire to do something and still have the thought, it seems like a pretty impulsive act. I might later come to that, but initially start with validation. And then finally, one last skill, and this is all about just a little practice related to how, when you're in conflict, do you ever notice you can get a little bit stubborn, just a little, and a little bit dug in, and a little bit, I am not willing to do this. I am just going to wait until they make the next move. We all get that way. So this is a skill when you notice yourself getting dug in and stubborn and resistant. In other words, you're unwilling to move and try and change the situation. You're at a stalemate. The key, one little tip, is to notice that you're getting unwilling. And it's often our body. We get tense, we get stubborn, and try and turn your mind to getting willing, which is really about trying to consciously make a choice. I'm going to practice trying to get willing. And one easier way to do this is to use physical relaxation to support it. So it can be very helpful just in a physical action, just let's say you're upset with somebody, you feel polarized, to actually just open your hands. You can do this where they don't have to notice that you're doing it, but it might be opening hands, open your body posture, and just your body posture open with your hands open is a way to get your body in a more willing and open place. And then once you get yourself a little bit more willing and open, then commit to then making an effective choice. So that's a way when you get stubborn and dug in yourself and you're at a stalemate with somebody. So I'll just finalize by just saying a few things about how do you do this in everyday life. I think, there's a few skills we've touched on. I think a lot of these things can be done in everyday life situations. For example, we talked about mindfulness, mindfully observe. You might practice that viewing the Trump photo, for multiple days. See what emerges for you as you look at his photo. And I know it's hard. And you might practice just routinely when you drink a coffee every morning or tea, is just notice the experience of drinking your coffee. And you might, so you can build some mindfulness activities into everyday life. You could also think about, well, maybe there's some ways I might benefit from managing my own distress. Maybe I need to think more about that just stop, take a step back skill. And maybe there's some ways to improve your relationships by, maybe I need to increase my validation. Maybe I need to work on, if somebody's really upset around me a lot, maybe I need to find a way to just help them get their arousal down by communicating that I really do understand that something they're saying makes a lot of sense. So My invitation to you is maybe take a moment, reflect on whether there's anything that I've shared today that you think it'd be helpful for you to strengthen. You might select one or even two of the skills I've talked about that you could prioritize. And if you decide that you want to try and strengthen these areas in your life, my invitation would be just choose one or two and consciously, deliberately practice it for the next 5 days. Just one, it might be 2 minutes a day. And then evaluate what's the impact of just doing that. Just one of those skills or two of those skills. So the invitation is to choose your own practice. And I will end there. I know we're at time. So thank you, everybody. Sure.
Thank you so much for that enlightening presentation, Dr. McMain. And now I'm going to invite, she's here, Tabitha Grove, to do the Q&A.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So many people are experiencing unprecedented levels of uncertainty and fear as events continue to unfold in the Middle East, as well as changes abound post-election in the United States. How do you suggest we cope with what seems to be almost constant and heightened global uncertainty?
Yeah, it's challenging for all of us, and it's very, first of all, it's very distressing to be watching what's going on in the world. It's also, I think we can easily get distressed and we can easily get very attached to continuing to watch it and almost have difficulty mindfully turning away from some of what's on the news. And I think being able to make a choice about, is this helpful for my health to be spending as much time flipping through the news of every moment of what's going on in Israel and in the US and all of the other disasters in the world. So I do think there's choices to be made of how much time. Is it beneficial? Is it helping our health to be actually tuning in with such a level to what's happening?
So younger generations are talking openly about not wanting to have children or get married in reaction to the stress they feel about the economic, environmental, world upheaval. How would you suggest older adults address these very real stressors with younger family members, friends, and coworkers?
Well, I know many people in that boat having those thoughts. I think it's important to listen to people. I think this is where validating and really understanding and helping people discuss what they're thinking, what they're feeling. And I think oftentimes, when younger people, especially if it's our kids, start telling us, we're not going to have kids, that can be triggering for us, especially as parents, if we want grandchildren. And we can have our own reaction, perhaps even if it's not our children, just because we may have some reactivity to somebody else. And I think that reactivity can get in the way of being open to hearing what the other person's experience is, to be able to listen to their experience, and to be truly able to help them actually also understand what their reaction is. It may be through conversation, it may be an emotion-mind decision, or it might be a wise-mind decision. It may be unclear. And I mean, if it is a wise-mind decision, and you'll probably know it when you hear it, when you really hear somebody talk from a place of wise mind, it'll be clear if that's wise mind. I would say in that state, you might need to do your own acceptance. This may not be what your child wants, and it may be what you wanted. So this is where radically accepting, another practice of mindfulness is that we're different. We have different ideas about what we want, and we don't always want the same thing. And so that's hard to do.
Oh, that's very much appreciated. So I guess another question is, how do you suggest that parents begin to support their children from early on as challenges impact their lives at home, school, and in the world?
I think that it's really important that we spend, and certainly, I mean, there's a lot of more of this being done in schools, but I think helping people talk about their feelings, talk about their emotions, not avoid their emotions. I mean, I'm delighted to see that in many school boards, they're bringing DBT skills and mindfulness into classroom settings, which is really helpful because there's many homes where kids don't talk about their emotions. They don't talk about what they're feeling. They don't have somebody to listen to them. And again, if we think of, well, why do people have mental health problems? Often because they've had lives where people have been neglecting or invalidating emotional experience, and they've learned to suppress and avoid their own experience. So I think the ability to have an open home where people can share what they're feelings is important, and hear what people really need, helping people express themselves effectively, model that. It's not always easy to do as a parent because we get reactive, it's difficult, and then we're busy with our lives and things can get in the way of us being there sometimes in the way that we want to be.
Yeah. So aging and illness are inevitable for all of us. How do you advise your clients to manage the stress that comes with these changes?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things that that's talked about, I think is the important as we age of really embracing just humility and our own vulnerability, that we're all going to be at a place where, we'll have lost certain capacities and we may need support, and it's being able to be open to those changes. And that's hard to do because we get attached to who we are and how we see our body and what we're capable of doing for ourselves. But, as we age, we're going to lose certain abilities. And maybe we won't, maybe we'll be lucky, but many of us will. We'll have aches and pains and maybe need somebody to support us. And it's hard to accept those changes. And I think it's often the lack of acceptance of that can interfere with often a lot of suffering.
Yeah. So individual stress that one member of a couple, because a lot of what you're talking with DBT is, it's your one half of a formula, may be experiencing can impact the emotional stability of both members of a couple. How do you suggest one person in a couple support their partner during a time of stress without losing their own footing?
And I think this is where you can see that dysfunctional dynamic that can occur when one person's really stressed, because whether it be stress due to illness and feeling irritable and feeling like you can't, seeing that you can't do things, and maybe getting short with your partner. And I think that it's easy, again, for all of us to get a bit reactive to that and to respond in a way that can perpetuate further dysregulation in the other person. And I think this is where, in these moments, accurate expression of what are you feeling, what do you need, being able to validate the other person is really critical to sort of reducing the dysfunctional communication and I think emotional distress that can occur between couples.
Right. Getting off the feedback loop.
Yeah.
So I'll invite anyone who's watching online to feel free to add more questions in the chat. And we have Pam here with the microphone if anyone wants to raise their hand. while waiting for that, I wanted to go back to how DBT is very emotion focused. So, tips for increasing emotional resilience as people are often not used to experiencing these feelings, and the more they begin to listen to them, it can become exhausting and you can go into that shutdown logic mode.
Yeah. I think there's several things that we can do. I think knowing when we're feeling more vulnerable or what makes us vulnerable, some basic things, being physically active and eating balanced diet, actually that hugely impacts our emotions and our vulnerability. Also, I think it's, engaging in activities that give us meaning, having some structure in our lives, doing things, contributing for other people. Those are ways to increase positive emotions and reduce our vulnerability to negative emotions. And certainly engaging in activities that and doing things to increase positive emotions, I think, is pretty important. So whether it's, if you spent the whole day working and then come home and feel upset looking at the news, well, there's not much perhaps that, if it's been a stressful day, actually finding ways what gives you pleasure and making sure that you're building that into everyday experiences.
All right. Yeah, we have Pam with the mic. Yeah. Sorry, it's just the people online can't hear you if you don't. Thanks.
If you're a couple and something out of nowhere just starts escalating, which tool should we use?
I would stop, in that moment. I do think that's when, and my husband's here, he knows. I would say, okay, stop. We're in emotion mind, both of us right now. Let's pause. Let's actually stop. Let's take a moment. It's in those moments when you're really escalated, it's easy to keep going, and that's when things are said that just escalate even further, and then it can have a lot of damage afterwards. But putting a pause button on and trying to re-regulate your emotions by breathing, by stepping back, by trying to re-access your own wise mind, trying to be mindful of what you're feeling, trying to remind yourself, what's really important to me? What do I really value? This is a person I'm with. I really care about this person. I really care about my relationship with them. That's what I really want. That's what's most important.
I'm asking this question after 40 years of marriage.
I stepped out for a minute. I hope I didn't miss the answer. What is the difference between CBT and DBT?
Yeah, it's a good question. So DBT was founded in part on cognitive behavior therapy. So cognitive behavior therapy presumes that dysfunction arises because of the way people perceive and think about the world. And so the pathway to changing how you're feeling and how you're behaving is by changing how you're perceiving the world, so changing your thinking. Whereas DBT's perspective is that dysfunction arises because people have problems with their ability to modulate their emotions. So that's a key difference. And therefore, the focus is on how do you modulate your emotions and how do you attune to your primary emotional experience? Because if you can do that, that will guide you towards effective, behavior. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Once the emotional mind has taken over and everything has exploded, and then there's estrangement, how do you begin the process to get back?
Yeah, okay, that's a good question. Well, so I think first thought is you may have a goal, and your goal may be, I want to get back with this person. It may not be their goal. But probably this is where you probably want to mindfully reflect on the relationship and really try and understand the other person's perspective. Really try and understand if you were in their shoes. So this is sort of stepping in their shoes, being empathic to their perspective. What was it that bothered them? And what was it that I really need to better understand? Because when you move towards a conversation, being able to validate their perspective is going to be key. You know, can you see things from their perspective? Maybe there was some annoying habit that you had that they just couldn't tolerate, and that was it. And really understanding what it was for them that really just drove them crazy. I'm simplifying. Obviously, these things are complicated. Of course, you know, you're going to have your own things and needs that you might want to express, you know, that you want to discuss with that person in order to repair.
But in order to repair, sometimes you do have to, in order to validate that other person, then sometimes you do have to submerge your own priorities in order to begin that repair process, right? You have to allow them to feel.
Yeah, I maybe wouldn't say submerge your priorities, but it may be just holding them. It may be just taking time to listen, and, you know, it probably isn't going to be a healthy relationship if it's only one side that's being heard. There's got to be reciprocity.
Yeah. Or accept that it won't be healthy as long as you're aware, so you can be in your sort of mindfulness that maybe this isn't balanced, but you want to get it back somehow if you really want it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a choice to be made. It may be, for example, you might effectively ask for what you want, you know, using the Dear Man scale. Maybe you try and work on communicating what you need in a really effective way. And keep in mind, oftentimes we have to ask repeatedly. Yeah. So we ask really effectively and the person doesn't do it. We ask again. I mean, because they've got their own habits to change. And so, but staying with it, not giving up, continuing to ask in an effective way increases the odds people will shift, but it doesn't guarantee it.
No.
Some people don't. And then,
well, and if it's a parent-child situation, it's a different balance, yeah.
And sometimes we might, after effectively asking many times, we might need to radically accept this person isn't maybe able to change, or, you know, they're not changing, and then I've got a decision about what do I want.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just say something? I was just saying to Mom, I'm originally from South Africa, so my parents used to come here every summer, and one day I got on my high horse the way I do occasionally, and my parents went to Mark and said, Mark, you know, what should we do with her? And Mark said to my mom and dad, just leave her. Let her calm down and only speak to her later on. And I thought, I'm going to have a good marriage.
That's great.
So just to actually piggyback on her question, what do you do when it's not an even relationship, when one person actually has either a mental health disorder or a personality disorder, and the relationship is not an optional one? It's I mean, I guess they're all optional, but it's, you know, a parent, child, sibling, in-law, like something that you are going to see that person.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my first thought that comes to mind is that when you say even, you know, the reality is life probably isn't never, things aren't fair, and things are never going to be even, and it's really more about, I think, figuring out are things so imbalanced that they maybe are intolerable for you, or is the balance okay? But, you know, maybe somebody does a little bit more here and somebody else does a little bit more there. But sometimes, you know, people have particular needs that may be greater. Maybe somebody with a serious illness, if you're looking after your partner who's now got dementia, you may have a lot of caregiving responsibilities, and there may not be a lot at that later stage with dementia that you're going to get back other than you're caring for your partner. And that's maybe okay, it doesn't have to be even, but it's a choice on what's within your own limits and what do you want.
Anyone else? No? Okay.
Okay. Well, it looks like this wraps up our Q&A. I just wanted to take a few minutes to thank you, Dr. McMain, for taking the time to be with us this evening to educate us and enlighten us about DBT, see all of these CBT. I have to tell you that when Doreen told us you were coming, I heard CBD.
That's why you're
but I must tell you that I'm not disappointed that you came to talk about something else. You've really enlightened us a great deal about this form of treatment, which was new, I think, to many of us, and one that will clearly be of significant value for many mental health conditions. Your extensive research and writing in this field has clearly provided many individuals with valuable tools to overcome some of the challenges they face and to help them find paths to well-being and success in both their personal and professional lives. I'd also like to thank our committee members, Doreen Saskin, Eleanor Baker, Lori Morgan-Silver, Tabitha Grove, and Sophie Bedard, and of course to you, Rabbi McCarroll, and to our wonderful media, communication, and tech help, David Rosenberg, Deanna Levy, Kate Wooten, and Pavel. Dr. McMain, as an expression of our gratitude to you, the Luke Sklar Mental Health Initiative has made a donation in honor of your presentation this evening to what I understand is one of your favorite charities, Out of the Cold. The Temple Library has also established a selection of books dedicated to mental health, and the Luke Sklar Mental Health Initiative has purchased a copy of your book entitled Psychotherapy Essentials to Go, Dialectic Behavior Therapy for Emotional Dysregulation, and it will be added to our Temple Library next week. Our ability to continue to provide our congregation and the community with expert speakers like tonight depends on generous donations. Please consider supporting the Luke Sklar Mental Health Initiative through the donation page of the Holy Blossom Temple website, perhaps in honor or in memory of someone special. And finally, thank you to our committee bakers. We hope you will help yourself now to refreshments, stay on and schmooze, as our inspiring evening with Dr. McMain concludes. So again, our heartfelt thanks, and thanks to all of you both online and here, and Lahitraut.